Hello and welcome to Varn Solo. And today, yet again, we're going to be talking about left-wing media. I'm sure it won't be the last time I talk about it, nor will it be the first. And in some ways, that's frustrating. Critiquing people's media choices and critiquing how they think that identifies them with a politics, a way of managing people. If we go back to the root of politics, it comes from polis. Now, polis is a political unit of ancient Greece. Right? It was both an administrative and religious center, usually in its original form was separate from the city, and it was expanded then to mean the city, so the administrative center of a Greek urban area in the ancient world that was administrated by both religious and civic powers, was expanded to mean the people who were under said rule and spoke a similar dialect around such a bounded geographical area. So, polis derived from administration. The administration to do what? Well, to collect power, to respect religious authority, to collect power, to collect taxes, to respect religious authority, and to adjudicate who had the right to use force to enforce the public will. Within the polis, there generally was an agora, which was a social and financial hub, an acropolis, a gymnasia, etc., and theaters, the entire entertainment complex. And the idea of a city-state comes from this form of self-administration. How these evolved is hard to know. We have seen other cities develop similarly, developing hierarchical administration and centralized bureaucracy. Although, like in Greece, many of them did not separate civic and religious functions. And in fact, the idea of religio as separate from civitas is actually somewhat of a early modern idea, even in the Christian world. Now, what does that have to do with left media? To say that left media is not political is to say that it does not participate in any of the administration of the public, and that is not true. But to say that it is political, or that it's the same as having a concrete political program, political action, local solidarity, is to say that your consumption choices and your personal frameworks actually have more effect than they likely do. So it is too easy to say that whether or not you listen to someone like a Jimmy Dore or Sam Cedar or Brianna Joy Gray or Ben Norton is not a political choice. But it's also too easy to say that it's the same as having a functional politics, even a functional politics that manifests what these individuals say they want. Recently, This is Revolution excerpted a clip from a few months ago at the beginning of the Roe v. Wade crisis where I critiqued parasocial relationships with Jimmy Dore and Sam Cedar. Predictably, I said that they were both tailing, although I think I may have said that Cedar was tailing the progressive left and Dore elements of the right. That perhaps is not true, because in some ways both of them are tailing different elements of both what is traditionally considered on the left and on the right. The reduction may be helpful for helping people think through what is going on, but it's not that helpful. And talking about the careers of two millionaire comedians from New York as if your choice of consuming their product was the primary choice of politics indicates how powerless you actually feel. But my point wasn't to even critique Sam Cedar or Jimmy Dore. I have issues with both of them. And I will say that both of them do not really comport to what I would like a modern American politics to be. And to say that they are just tailists or grifters or whatever is to miss the point. I believe that both Dore and Sam Cedar probably believe everything that they say. I have no reason not to. There are times where it seems like these things are dictated by different narratives that are bound by choices and selection of peers, but that's true for everybody, including me, which is why selecting your peers is important. But again, it is not the only element of politics. What has really resulted from these? Has political change happened? When I was talking about the parasocial relationships, people missed the first point. The point about game theory. The point that the trajectory of the progressives and the Democratic Party was set by who was going to pay them, even if they believe what they say, even if they are non-cynical actors. They are empowered by paymasters, and they have to build coalitions. For example, in AOC's first year, she did not try to oust Nancy Pelosi because she correctly said there was no one to the left of her available who could win the seat. Now, you could critique the Bernie movement as a whole for not having built apparatuses for years before the Bernie run in 2016 to allow there to be a viable seat. But then again, even that would have to deal with the fact that the conditions on the ground, the decline of the union movement until 2012, the empowerment of the Obama administration during the recession, the way things like QE and toxic assets buyups were used to stabilize the markets, and these were not expansive to the general public, set the whole field in motion. People create their world, but it is not of their own making. The history weighs upon them. So, of course, I end up getting in a fight with a lot of people in the comment section who then try to turn it on me and ask me what my goal is. Why don't I go on TYT? Why don't I go on the gray zone? Why don't I? Because I'm not asked to. My audience is not large enough. And also because that's not my goal. When I worked for Zero Books, one of the big fights between Doug Lane and I that were not personal was over how you handled a clickbait, the debates of the moment, the elements of the culture war. I thought these were easy targets, but they often did not pay off. That you may ride yourself to major audience for one of them and never be able to replicate it again. And that often the clickbait titles of my videos made people confused as to what I was even saying. They read the headline. The headline set their interpretive hermeneutic, this is a big word for your interpretive framework, and they responded accordingly, not realizing that the headline was not mine, and it was designed to drive clicks. A lot of my headlines, like the one today, the day I decided to fight most of the internet, they are just to get attention, but they are to also to confound you, so that you come here with a sense of cognitive dissonance, and you either reject it outright or you want to learn. You don't have to accept what I say, right? And picking on two of the largest media productions and saying that neither one of them were evil but both had done things that I disliked. And if anything, Sam Cedar had empowered more people who I saw was on my side, despite the fact that, yes, if he's tailing Democrats, he is in some ways, from my perspective, tailing to the right too. Different right, different criterion. And for people who absolutize these criterions of left and right, as if that always makes sense, try to figure out the content to them. Political movements, ideologies, have an interesting trajectory. When they're in power, they don't need to be coherent. Power itself and the temperaments that undergird those power are their own reward. When they emerge, however, they do need to be coherent. They need a coherent political subject, coherent definitions, coherent ways of approaching the world, coherent research programs, etc. Now, in the case of liberalism and conservatism, that has never been entirely true, but there have always been attempts to do this. The progressive era for liberalism, classical liberalism, even though that is far more diverse and even included pre-Marxian socialist, it is still the case that it was aiming to clarify itself according to principles and ideas that emerged in the early Enlightenment and battle out which ideas did. And they also had corresponding political subjectivities, the settler nation, etc. Once you achieve power, the goal becomes the maintenance of power, at least in contemporary politics, which even as George Orwell, for all his flaws, and I don't want to get into them here, was right to say one of the ironies of socialism is that one wants to take power to distribute power. It's not just the redistribution of wealth. In fact, in many ways, Marx talks about that not being the point. It's the redistribution of power and the relations of production. One of the things that I've been trying to point out for years is in the immediate strategic and tactical terms, we often just forget our principles. And when that doesn't work, we tend to substitute identities for the principles, which leads us to be bound in our choices and responding often negatively through negative partisanship, through owning the libs or spiting the conservatives as to what we do. I was listening to a podcast, and I don't speak German, and they were talking about the right wing and a lot of this new MAGA communist, LaRouche reemergence, and they mentioned Dorr quite a bit, etc. And they were like, well, and they were specifically talking about the People's Party and how it had degenerated with people like Chris Hedges, Cornel West, Nina Turner backing it up to a bunch of sex scandals and slacks that are constantly purging members, etc. Now, I don't know the context, but it's not surprising to me that a highly decentralized movement based on a few key personalities that were increasingly focused on media figures, who also increasingly make forays into talking about left-right coalitions, the unity of left-right populism, etc., as if the differences between these were not important. And as if they were not really dealing with the content of that populism. Problem with tailism, and let's talk about what it is. I'm going to do another video that goes into this in more detail, but tailism is a concept that instead of offering workers what you think is best and letting them to decide to accept it and to help produce the program that would bring it about, you offer them what you think is already popular. You tail already existing trends. Both the alliance with the Democrats, as it currently stands in the DSA, and attempts to do populist coalitions are tailist. Both are based on electoral strategies that have never produced effects of any significant size. While the reformist effects at least can point to elements of the civil rights movement for their political viability, the third party apparatus that starts with a national campaign post the 1960s has no track record of doing anything but creating abilities for people to raise money and put themselves on ballots and lose. The third-party strategy in the early 20th century was quite different. It was not focused nationally. They emerged out of coalitions of local groups. Their focus was originally local electoral politics, and they built coalitions accordingly. Now, I don't know that that would work in this environment either. There are 50 states that you have to change the laws in to allow this to happen. But if one was going to build a base for an alternative political movement and one was going to vote strategically, and I personally only think socialists should be voting for capitalist parties to stop things that they would oppose, which is what the United Front has done. What you don't want to be seen as doing is being the people running, or in a coalition with people running a capitalist state. When things go south, it costs you credibility. No. Regardless, that's still a very hard prospect, and not one that we've seen work in a long time. And in fact, we could argue that we've never seen it work in America. And when it almost worked in the 1890s to the 1920s, it was quickly subsumed into the progressive movement and then subsumed into the Democrats back when they were still, frankly, a party that was aligned to the fading Southern rump remains of the planter class, as well as elements of the petite bourgeoisie in the North. And when FDR shifts that coalition, you do see a coalitional shift. And that is actually for the first time you see large amounts of descendants of slaves start backing the Democrats, whereas priorly they were staunchly and solidly Republican. So your relationship to your media consumption is often a distraction, but it's one that I even predicted in the clip excerpted by TIR would get worse as economic conditions got more unstable, and as people's attempts to build political alternatives proved to be fruitless. Projection is common in this situation. Now, people, of course, can question my motives. Do I want to be famous? Do I want to make a lot of money? Obviously, I do care that a large group of people know my name because I make a podcast. But I have never tried to get on major shows. I have also not turned down major shows unless I thought it would hurt my point. And on this point, it would. My agenda is set by what I want. Part of what I want is different. But we have to deal with the realities of people on the ground. So when I was listening to the I Don't Speak German podcast talking about the People's Party and the way they will often demonize poor people of color who vote Democratic because that's literally the only thing they can do to stop, a Republican going in and like slashing things even deeper, I began to think about a bind, because in some sense that is true. But you do have to say there has to be a point where you have to admit that that is a capture. And if you constantly tell people, well, I understand that you can't change things, it makes rational sense, you have to admit that you don't have anything on offer. The demonization really comes from the fact that these people have not been able to offer anything of substance to these people that is different. And this is also true, frankly, with the demonization of rural poor people, which are often viewed as white because they are more conservative, etc. No. Even Marxists on the internet making analogies of rural Americans to peasants doesn't even make a lot of sense. The political economy is fundamentally different. But the rural-urban divide has been a divide in the development of modern politics since the Enlightenment in Europe. And you also see similar tensions develop in places like India, etc. In China, this was largely avoided until the Dengist period, while it also emerged there. And it was part of the pre-communist Chinese tensions with urban elites often lording over the rural poor and peasant revolts resulting peasant revolts having all kinds of character from reactionary to progressive. It's impossible to singularly point out to one orientation that emerges from them, just like it's impossible to singularly point out that there's only one orientation that emerges from Jimmy Dore and Cedar. What I originally said is Jimmy Dore's predictive capacity of what the Democrats were going to do tended to be better than people who were tied to the Democrats. But his predictive capacity of MAGA Republicans or whatever seems to have been completely worse. Your blind spot tells you where your own choices are. To come back to the point I was making, though, about left politics, one of the reasons why this has happened is we have not been able to make a subject. For example, even on the definitions of who's productive, what class, how do we define that? There's not one consistent criteria. There's never been one consistent criteria, and attempts to make consistent criteria out of the notes we have from Marx and Engels, for example, separating class from social categories because classes mentioned in the political writings are not mentioned in the economic analysis ones, and so they should be considered social categories as they have no defining relation to production, are useful for an analytic understanding Marx, but are not necessarily useful as a way to posit politics. I was arguing with someone about workers, and they're like, the PMC is not in the interest of the majority of workers, it's productive workers. And I was like, productive workers, even if you include logistic workers, are only 13% of the modern developed world economy. And they are also an increasingly smaller part of the non-developing, of the 13% of the, 13% of the developed world economy. And they are also an increasingly smaller percent of the developing world economy. While nowhere nearly reduced in most areas as, say, the classical subsistence peasant has been, which really only exists in a few places in South America, Central America, and Southeast Asia, and then smaller and smaller percentages at that. I guess you can also include some places in Africa, but the idea that most of these places are still rural peasantry of subsistence farmers is fundamentally not true, and underestimates the development capacities locally of places like Africa, India, etc. No, we have found that automation has made this a lot easier to do, and only certain fields have been resistant to automation. But automation never completely gets rid of the labor element. This is also true. You still need people to run the machines, you still need people for parts of the output, and you still need to extract value in places. We can't define these things anymore. Like when I ask people what the PMC is, I get 4 or 5 different definitions. So for me, it's something that may be useful for talking about categories of educated people who have been indoctrinated with certain kinds of values by the dint of their education, and who have, because of skills capture, credentialing, and carteling, some special access. We have to ignore that there are other fields that have nothing to do with education that are credentialed and carteled and also have special access, even whole fields of contractors, that many of the people we're talking about actually own their own means of production when we're talking about, quote, productive labor, unquote, that even with all that, they're only 13% of the population, that the population with education is about 40%. And if you don't deal with baby boomers, it's an even higher percentage of people who have some exposure to education. Now, they don't all work in fields that require degrees, so they don't all succeed at getting into the fields that having a degree would get you to, and the conditions for certain of those fields with broad public support, nursing, social work. The social workers have less public support, but teachers also have declining public support. They are increasingly precarized and are increasingly losing their credentialed and protected status. If nothing else, the state needs to just get more bodies into the situation because they've been incredibly, in the United States, unattractive jobs. They have high burnout and high turnover despite relatively decent pay and some stable benefits. We don't agree on these definitions. We don't understand what criterion would emerge to do them. And this is why we have Twitter debates. And in lieu of clarifying that and building these institutions locally and hashing out these disagreements, we try to shortcut it by tailing an already existing political movement to be able to benefit from their base. But we're often ignoring the fact that political movement that we are building that's trying to tail off of parasitically off another one will never be trusted for that reason. Democrats will never trust leftists, not really, because they know if we succeed, they lose, even though we are allies, in quotation marks, in the way it's often portrayed. Same with rightists. MAGA communists will not be treated well by the vast majority of Trumpists. And while, yes, you might see LaRouche-packed people aiding Stop the Steal people in red state elections, in fact, we are seeing that, we have to ask ourselves, well, why did LaRoucheism come back in the first place? Who gave it money? And how did this happen? And why are people who considered themselves leftists just a few weeks ago, very young people, moving to more and more rigid ideologies with less and less connection to any actual political base, or even the classes they claim to care about? And it's because these interactions have to go somewhere and they're easily manipulated. And they're not just manipulated by the media figures who, like I said, I don't have any reason to doubt that either Sam Seder or Jimmy Dore believe at least 80 to 90% of what they say. And even if they didn't, it's not relevant. I can't know a man's heart or a woman's heart or anybody's heart unless I have, documentary proof that they're lying. But in many ways, that's irrelevant. My point was not for people to moralize which millionaire comedian that they liked, who was good and who was bad, but to get them out of the bind. And I immediately realized that the way the media is set up and the way people have engaged with this and the disenfranchisement in which they feel and their inability to manifest a different politics, even though they feel like the one is needed, makes it inevitable that they're not going to hear my point. And then when I call that out, they're going to think I'm doing a special pleading game. Not everybody, but a lot. And you know what? That's fair. It looks like it. And it looks like I'm also me tooing them, or equivocating them or whatever to a lot of people. You have to judge these things not on who says them, but why they say them. But also, you can't pretend that heuristics of trust aren't real. Even people who say they only care about truth will tell me lies all the time because they got them from communities which they value more than other communities. And if they don't see that about themselves, that's their own blind spot. And I have also passed on information that was false because I trusted the source without verifying. I try not to do that, but everybody does. So I'm not morally condemning these people except when they fight me. And that's what I mean by the day I chose to fight the entire internet, because I didn't just go after fans of Jimmy Dore or fans of Sam Seder. And in fact, the fact that I mentioned their name in the algorithm, I'm not going to put it in anything in this clip because I don't want this famous for that. What has happened is that in our political powerlessness, we have replaced political organization effectively with fandoms. This is understandable, but this is the aestheticization of politics. It won't go well, and it isn't. There's no third party on the horizon, and there's no way in which you're going to see the Democrats switch to a hyper-progressive mode today or tomorrow, even if things maybe aren't as bad as they were a month or 2 months ago. And it's not that these groups do nothing. And it's not that everything the Democrats do is betrayal, or even everything the Republicans do is betrayal. It's that we cannot trust the current incentives to produce much in those venues, and we have no means of changing them the way we are currently construing ourselves. So retreating into identity makes a lot of sense. And people may go, Varn, you don't offer us answers. And that's happened a lot. I do offer some answers. I talk about translocal coordination, building up dual power institutions, that this is slow and tedious, and that's what you need to build. If you have a party, you need to build it out of a coalition of these groups and other parties, that these groups need to be built up and already exist so that you can offer things before you have a party or political power, that these, but that you also have to be careful because some of these things can easily turn into NGOs, and that will become a problem in and of itself. There are 1,000 things I could tell you to do, and I have mentioned a lot of them, but none of them get you what you want at a national level fast enough. And my problem is the national focus is both too ambitious and not ambitious enough. It doesn't deal with the world situation of which this is situated, although in the US it would have a lot of effect. But it also does not build up local power. And people think that the alternative media has somehow created a new way to deal with this, but we operate under the same laws of distribution and the same national and international focus as anyone else. The reason why I don't ever use my show to do, like, say, local political things in Utah where I actually organize is, like I've said, it wouldn't be effective for it. The alternative media does not transcend the flaws of the traditional media because it's built off the same infrastructure. Regardless, I will be doing more of these. I'm going to do nailing it down, going into what tailism has meant through the last 120 years or so, and why it is a problem, and its relationship to strategies like the United Front and the Popular Front. And I'll be doing that next week. Other upcoming shows that I've announced are still upcoming. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, blah, blah, blah. Enjoy your parasocial relationship with me. Have a good day.